"You're a bitter old man who can't let go," my daughter said. And that was the moment her husband grabbed my late wife's antique clock off the mantel and hurled it across the room at my chest. It missed my ribs by inches, shattered against the fireplace behind me, and a shard opened up a gash along my forearm before I even understood what had happened. And here's the part nobody in that living room understood. I laughed, not a nervous laugh, a real one, because I had been waiting 4 months for someone in that family to finally show me who they really were. My name is Walter Hensley. I'm 71 years old. I spent 34 years as an electrical contractor in Tulsa, Oklahoma, wiring up half the strip malls and church additions on the east side of town. And this is the story of the Thanksgiving that cost me a daughter and gave me my life back. I live alone in a 4-bedroom house off South Yale Avenue, the same house my wife Dorothy and I built in 1987, back when we were young enough to think we'd fill every room with grandkids running through it barefoot. Dorothy died 3 years ago from a stroke. Sudden, no warning, gone before the ambulance even made it out of the driveway. Since then, the house has echoed in a way I never got used to. I keep the thermostat too high, because the quiet feels colder than it actually is. My daughter Renee is 39. She married a man named Curtis Boyle 9 years ago, and they have one son, my grandson Micah, who's 11. The extra bedrooms upstairs, the ones Renee and her younger brother grew up in before he moved to Denver for work, mostly sit closed off now, except when Micah stays over some weekends, which used to happen a lot more than it does now. About 4 months before Thanksgiving, Curtis lost his job at a logistics company outside the city, and not long after that, Renee mentioned, almost in passing, that they were behind on their mortgage. I told them I'd help if they needed groceries or a car repair, whatever a father does, and I meant it. But the conversation kept circling back, week after week, to the house. Specifically, to my house. To the 2 empty bedrooms and the finished basement I'd wired myself back in the 90s, currently used for nothing but storing Dorothy's old sewing machine and boxes of Christmas decorations. I noticed it the way you notice a draft in a room before you ever find the source. Little comments. Renee asking how much the property taxes ran me every year, like she was doing math in her head. Curtis walking through the basement during a visit, tapping the walls, saying things like, "This could really be something with the right renovation." I didn't say anything at first, because I told myself I was being a suspicious old man, the kind of thing Dorothy used to gently tease me about. But the suspicion didn't fade. It grew roots. About 6 weeks before Thanksgiving, I sat down with my attorney, a woman named Priya Akar, who had handled Dorothy's estate paperwork and had become, over the years, someone I trusted the way you trust. Very few people left in your life. I told her what I'd been noticing, the comments, the basement, the tone underneath all of it. Priya didn't roll her eyes or tell me I was overreacting. She told me to document everything, keep my finances and my will airtight, and to call her the moment anything crossed from uncomfortable into something else. We joked, a little grimly, that we were building a fire escape nobody hoped they'd need. I remember laughing about it in her office. I did not know how soon that fire escape would matter. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, Renee called me on a Sunday evening while I was refilling the bird feeder in the backyard. She sounded bright in that particular way she used to sound right before she asked me for something as a teenager, back when she wanted to borrow the truck for a date she hadn't told me about yet. She said Curtis's parents were driving up from Waco, and wouldn't it be nice if everybody came here, to my house, for Thanksgiving this year, the whole family together, like it used to be when Dorothy was alive. I said that sounded fine, and it did sound fine, on the surface. I hadn't hosted a big Thanksgiving since Dorothy passed, and some part of me, the part that still missed the noise of a full house, wanted to say yes before I'd even finished thinking it through. What I didn't know was that Renee and Curtis had already had a conversation the week before about how a full house, a warm holiday, everyone fed, and a little sentimental would be the easiest possible setting to finally ask me the question they'd been circling for months. I found this out much later. At the time, I was just a lonely old man, pulling out the folding tables from the garage, buying a turkey bigger than I needed, and setting Dorothy's good china on the table for the first time in 3 years, because some habits don't disappear just because the person who started them did. Thanksgiving morning came in cold and clear, that flat Oklahoma light that makes everything look a little sharper than usual. Renee, Curtis, and Micah arrived first around 11, and Curtis's parents, Hal and Denise Boyle, pulled in about half an hour later in a car that looked like it had seen better decades. Micah ran straight for the backyard to find the old tire swing I still hadn't taken down, and for a little while, it actually felt like something close to normal. Denise complimented the china. Hal talked about the Cowboys game coming on later. I remember thinking maybe I'd been imagining things after all. Dinner started around 2. Turkey, cornbread dressing, green beans the way Dorothy used to make them, sweet potatoes with the marshmallow topping Micah always asked for. About halfway through the meal, Curtis set his fork down and looked around the dining room slowly, the same way he'd looked around that basement a month earlier. "This place is something else, Walter," he said. "All this room, and it's just you rattling around in it most days, isn't it?" I said something simple back, agreed it was a lot of house for one person, didn't think much of it in the moment. Renee glanced at Curtis across the table. Quick. The kind of look I caught but didn't fully understand yet. Hal cleared his throat and started talking about the drive up from Waco instead, which felt, even then, like a deliberate change of subject. I didn't know it yet, but that was the calm before the part of the day I would never forget. Dessert hadn't even come out when Renee set her glass down harder than she needed to and said what she'd clearly been building toward through the entire meal. "Dad," she said, "Curtis lost his job. You know that. And we're 3 months behind on the mortgage. And you've got the basement and 2 whole bedrooms just sitting empty up there. I think it makes sense for us to move in here for a while, just until we're back on our feet." The table went quiet except for Micah, still laughing about something out in the living room with the television on. I set my own fork down slowly and told her that I understood things were hard for them, that I meant it when I said I wanted to help, but that my house was my home, not a solution to somebody else's mortgage, and that I wasn't comfortable turning it into a permanent living arrangement, even for my own daughter. Renee's face changed fast. The warmth from earlier slid right off it. "It's not permanent, Dad. It's just until we save up. And that basement just sits there collecting dust while we're drowning." Curtis jumped in, trying to sound reasonable and landing somewhere closer to cornered. "Walter, come on. It's not that big an ask. We're your family." I looked at my daughter, at the girl I'd taught to ride a bike in the driveway of that exact house. And I told her as calmly as I could that it was still my decision, and that right now the answer was no. Hal and Denise sat there looking like they wished they were anywhere else. Denise's eyes were down on her plate. Hal was turning his water glass slowly in his hand, like he wanted to disappear into it. I don't think they'd asked for this fight to happen at my table, and looking back, I still believe that. But Renee wasn't finished, and neither was Curtis, and the temperature in that dining room was about to climb faster than I expected. Curtis stood up so fast his chair scraped hard against the hardwood, the same sound I remembered from arguments with my own father decades ago in a different kitchen. "You're being selfish," he said, loud enough that Micah went quiet in the next room. "All this space for one old man, and you can't help your own daughter's family." I told him to keep his voice down, that there was an 11-year-old 10 feet away, but he kept going, saying I'd always been this way, always more concerned with my own comfort, always making things harder than they needed to be. Renee's voice climbed right alongside his. "You're a bitter old man who can't let go," she said. "You keep this whole house like some kind of shrine to Mom, and meanwhile your own grandson doesn't even have a stable home to grow up in." I stayed seated. I stayed calm, because 34 years of standing on ladders arguing with contractors twice my size about code violations had taught me that raising my own voice back only gave the other man more to push against. I told them both, evenly, that this conversation was finished, that my home wasn't up for negotiation at my own dinner table, and that if they needed help with the mortgage, we could talk about actual numbers instead of moving in. That was when Curtis reached over to the mantel behind him, grabbed Dorothy's old mantel clock, the one her mother had given us as a wedding present in 1986, and threw it across the room at me. I got my arm up just enough that it caught my forearm instead of my chest, shattered against the brick of the fireplace, and a piece of the glass casing sliced a line into my skin that started bleeding almost immediately, dark red running down onto my shirt sleeve. The room went dead silent except for Micah's small voice from the living room asking what that noise was. For a few full seconds, nobody moved. Curtis's arm was still extended where he'd let the clock go, his face somewhere between shock and disbelief at his own hands. Renee sat frozen, staring at the blood already soaking through my sleeve. Hal was up out of his chair, reaching for a napkin nobody had asked him for, and Denise had both hands pressed over her mouth. I looked down at my arm, at the blood collecting in the crease of my elbow, and then I did something that confused every single person in that room. I laughed, not loud, not dramatic, just a short, genuine laugh, because in that exact moment, bleeding at my own Thanksgiving table, I understood with total clarity that everything I had quietly prepared for over the last month and a half had just become necessary, and I no longer had to wonder if I'd been imagining things. "Dad," Renee said, her voice cracking, "are you okay?" He didn't mean, and I held up my good hand to stop her without saying a word. I stood up, walked to the front closet, and pulled my jacket and keys off the hook, pressing one of Dorothy's old dish towels against the cut the whole time. "Where are you going?" Renee called after me, somewhere between panic and confusion. I told her I was heading to the hospital, and that she should stay and take care of her guests and her son. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't point a finger at anyone. I just walked out my own front door with blood soaking into a kitchen towel, got into my truck in the driveway, and pulled away while my daughter stood in the doorway behind me, still not understanding what she'd just started. The drive to St. Francis Hospital took about 14 minutes, and I remember every one of them clearly. I kept the towel pressed against my arm with one hand and drove with the other, steadier than I probably had any right to be given the circumstances. At a red light on 71st Street, I pulled my phone out with my free hand and typed a short message to Priya HR, the attorney who'd been getting ready for this moment right alongside me, without either of us knowing exactly when it would land. The message said only 3 words: "It's happening now." I want to explain what that meant, because it wasn't some line from a movie. 6 weeks earlier, after I'd told Priya what I'd been noticing, she'd explained that guilt trips and pressure, ugly as they are, don't carry any legal weight on their own. But if something ever turned physical, even something that looked at first like it might have been an accident, that was an entirely different matter. We'd agreed that if that day ever came, my first move, before calling her, before calling anyone, was to get myself to a hospital and let the injury get documented by professionals. Because a medical record made in the moment carries an honesty that memories and arguments after the fact simply can't match. It was never about revenge for its own sake. It was about making sure that if my family ever crossed a line they couldn't walk back, there would be an honest record of it starting the second it happened. I walked into the emergency room at St. Francis with a bloody dish towel wrapped around my forearm, and a nurse named Callie took one look and had me in a treatment room inside of 10 minutes. Dr. Alvarez, a soft-spoken man in his 50s with careful hands, looked at the cut and told me it ran almost 2 inches and would need 8 stitches. While he worked, he asked the routine questions: how it happened, whether I felt safe at home, and I told him plainly that my son-in-law had thrown an object at me during an argument at Thanksgiving dinner. His expression barely moved, but I could tell he'd heard versions of this story before and knew exactly what came next. He explained, gently, that hospital policy required him to notify the police whenever a patient came in hurt by another person, especially in a situation involving family, and that an officer would probably want to talk to me before I left. I told him I understood. Some part of me had been expecting exactly that. About 20 minutes after he finished stitching me up, a Tulsa police officer came through the curtain, notepad already out. His name was Reyes, a heavy-set man in his 40s with an unhurried way about him that told me this wasn't his first time taking a report like mine. He asked me to walk him through the whole evening, and I did, keeping my voice level, not exaggerating, not leaving anything out either. I told him about the request to move in, about my refusal, about the yelling, about Curtis grabbing the clock off the mantel and throwing it at me in front of his own son and his own parents. Officer Reyes wrote it all down, asked a few clarifying questions. Exactly where I'd been sitting, how far Curtis had been standing, whether it looked deliberate or like something that slipped during an argument. I told him honestly it looked deliberate to me, that Curtis had picked the clock up with both hands and thrown it, not knocked it over by accident. He nodded, told me it would be filed as an assault report, and that he'd be following up with Curtis directly to hear his side. While he finished writing, my phone buzzed over and over in my jacket pocket, Renee's name lighting up the screen each time. I didn't answer, not out of spite, but because I genuinely didn't trust myself to say the right thing yet. That same evening, while I sat at home with 8 stitches and a bandage wrapped around my forearm, Officer Reyes and his partner drove out to Renee and Curtis's place to get his account. Standard procedure whenever a report like mine gets filed. I heard how it went a few days later, partly from Renee and partly from Priya, who had a way of finding things out. Curtis apparently tried to explain it as an accident, said he'd only been gesturing while he argued, and the clock slipped. The trouble for him was that explanation didn't line up with what his own parents had already told the officer that night. Both Hal and Denise, along with Renee, confirmed Curtis had picked the clock up deliberately and thrown it across the room. Officer Reyes told him plainly that the injury, the distance the clock traveled, and 3 separate witness statements didn't support an accident, and that the report would move forward as assault, with the district attorney's office deciding how to proceed. I'm told Curtis argued about it for a long while before finally going quiet. Renee, from what she told me herself later, stood in the kitchen through most of it, not saying much, still trying to understand how one argument about a mortgage had turned into police officers standing in her living room on Thanksgiving night. Over the following days, my phone rang constantly, mostly Renee, occasionally Curtis, voicemails swinging between apology and something closer to resentment depending on the hour. I let most of it go to voicemail and focused on healing, and on sitting down with Priya to figure out what came next. Because that message at the red light had only ever been the beginning, not the whole plan. In her office about a week later, we talked through my options. I told her I had no interest in dragging this out longer than it needed to go, or punishing anyone beyond whatever the courts decided was fair for what had actually happened. But I also told her I was finished being treated like a housing solution by people who were supposed to love me for reasons that had nothing to do with square footage. Priya suggested two things. First, a protective order giving both households some legally enforced distance while the assault charge worked through the system. Second, and this mattered more to me personally, restructuring my will and setting up a trust so that the house and my savings would go directly to Micah's future, his education, his first car, whatever he'd need starting out, administered by Priya rather than by Renee or Curtis, with me keeping full control while I was still alive to use it. This wasn't about cutting my daughter out forever, and it wasn't about punishing an 11-year-old for his parents' choices. It was about making sure nobody could ever again treat my home or my finances as something up for negotiation, using guilt at a dinner table instead of respect. Priya filed everything within the week, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was steering my own life again, instead of just reacting to whatever came at me next. About 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, against Priya's advice, and honestly against my own better judgment too, I let Renee and Curtis come by to talk in person. The stitches had come out by then, leaving a thin line on my forearm the doctor said would fade some, but probably never disappear completely. Renee looked like she hadn't slept much. Curtis looked worse. They sat stiffly on my living room couch, while I sat across from them in Dorothy's old reading chair by the window. Renee apologized first, her voice unsteady, said she never wanted any of this, that watching the bills pile up for months had made her say things she didn't fully mean. I told her I believed she regretted it now, but that regret didn't undo what had happened, and that a grown man throwing a heavy object across a room hard enough to draw blood was never an acceptable way to handle an argument, no matter how stressed anyone felt. Curtis tried to ask if there was any way I could talk to the district attorney and make the charge disappear. I told him plainly that this wasn't mine to control anymore, that the state was handling it now, and that he'd need to face whatever the process decided, same as anyone else would. I also told them about the trust I'd set up for Micah, explained it wasn't punishment, it was simply making sure my home and my money were protected for my grandson's future instead of sitting there as something to argue over during holidays. Renee went quiet for a long moment, staring at the floor, and I could see something shifting behind her eyes, somewhere between shame and finally understanding what she and Curtis had lost sight of over the past several months. Curtis's court date came about 9 weeks later. First offense, no prior record, so the district attorney's office offered a plea instead of taking it to trial. He pleaded guilty to assault, and the judge gave him 60 hours of community service, a fine, and 6 months of mandatory anger management, along with the protective order Priya had already put in place, staying active for the same stretch of time. No dramatic courtroom scene, just a quiet, practical outcome that matched what had actually happened. I didn't attend the hearing. I spent that afternoon in the garage, instead, rewiring an old lamp of Dorothy's that had been sitting broken for years, because Priya told me my written statement had already said everything that needed saying. Word travels in a neighborhood like mine the way it always does, and I was surprised how many people reached out. My neighbor Ruth from across the street brought over a casserole one evening just to check on me. An old crew foreman I hadn't talked to in years called just to make sure I was doing all right. Nobody made me feel foolish for calling the police or hiring a lawyer over my own family. That meant more than I expected it to. Curtis lost the mortgage situation entirely, and it turned out the bank had a hardship program he and Renee qualified for once they actually sat down and asked, something that had been available the whole time and never once required moving into anyone's basement. They downsized to a smaller rental across town within their actual budget a few months later. There had been a real solution all along, one that never needed to involve guilt or a mantel clock or my house. By late winter, things between Renee and me had started, slowly, to find something like a new normal. She reached out on her own, without Curtis, more than once, asking if we could get coffee, just the two of us. During those conversations, she apologized again, this time without asking me to make anything go away or pretend it hadn't happened. She admitted that watching the bills pile up had let something ugly take over that she hadn't recognized in herself until she saw the blood on my sleeve. I told her I appreciated hearing that and that I still loved her, but that trust would need to rebuild slowly, through actions over time, not through a single conversation over coffee. Curtis and I spoke exactly once, right after the court proceedings ended. A short, careful exchange where he thanked me, a little awkwardly, for not pushing the DA towards something harsher than what he got. I told him honestly I hoped the counseling actually helped him, and that I hoped someday the two of us could sit at a table together again without either of us flinching, but that the choice about when that happened wasn't only mine to make anymore, and that some doors take longer to open than others, especially the ones slammed shut that hard. I started seeing Micah again on a regular schedule, usually just Renee bringing him over on Sunday afternoons. And slowly, the upstairs bedrooms filled back up with the sound of a kid building model airplanes on the old desk that used to be his mother's, exactly the way that room was always meant to be used. It's been almost a year now since that Thanksgiving, and my life looks different than it did back then, quieter in some ways, fuller in others. The scar on my forearm is barely visible unless you know where to look, though I notice Renee's eyes drift there sometimes when we're talking, like she's remembering something she'd rather forget. The trust Priya set up for Micah is still in place, still fully under my control while I'm around to use it, and I've made my peace with the fact that protecting it wasn't cold or bitter. It was simply responsible, the kind of thing Dorothy would have wanted done for our grandson without a single ounce of guilt attached. I fixed up that old clock, the one Curtis threw, glued the casing back together, and had a jeweler friend replace the cracked face. It sits back on the mantel now, ticking a little unevenly, but ticking. Some Sundays, Micah asks me to tell him again how it got that little crack near the base, and I tell him it's a story for when he's older. Renee and I are rebuilding something real, slower than either of us would probably like, but real, one Sunday afternoon at a time instead of pretending everything's fine the way we used to. I never went looking for revenge that Thanksgiving. Not really. Not the way people usually mean that word. All I ever wanted was for my own home, my own safety, and my own decisions to finally be respected by the people who were supposed to respect them more than anyone else. And sometimes protecting yourself calmly, honestly, and within the law is the only kind of revenge that actually holds up over time. If you made it this far, thank you for sticking with my story to the end. If it meant something to you, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Hit that like button, subscribe if you want more stories like this one, because I've got plenty more where this came from.